The summer sun hung hot and heavy over the frontier in the early 1870s. Dust rolled across the narrow streets of the small town of Silver Creek, a settlement that had grown quickly along a trade route used by ranchers, hunters, and wagon travelers moving west. Wooden buildings lined the main street. There was a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small boarding house, and a noisy saloon where cowboys often gathered after long days on the trail. On that particular afternoon, the sound of slow hoofbeats drifted through the quiet town. Heads turned. And Panas, Apache warrior, rode into Silver Creek. His name was Dakota, and he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent his life surviving the harsh lands of the Southwest. His dark horse moved steadily beneath him, and across the saddle hung bundles of carefully prepared deer hides. These hides were not trophies, they were trade goods. Dakota had not come looking for trouble. He had come for grain. The previous winter had been difficult for his people. The winds had been colder than usual, and wild game had been harder to find. The tribe's supply of corn and flour had nearly run out. As one of the younger but respected hunters in the camp, Dakota had volunteered to travel to the nearby settlements and trade what he could. Trade between settlers and native tribes was not unusual in the frontier. Deer hides, furs, and handmade crafts were often exchanged for tools, flour, salt, and grain. Yet fear and misunderstanding had grown between many communities over the years. Because of that history, Dakota knew the ride into town might bring uncomfortable stares, and he was right. As he rode slowly down the street, townspeople paused in their work to watch him pass. A rancher standing near the hitching rail narrowed his eyes. A woman pulling her child along the sidewalk hurried across the street. Two cowboys leaning against the saloon door stopped talking and rested their hands near their holsters, not drawing their guns, but making it clear they were ready if needed. Dakota noticed everything, but he showed no anger. His grandfather had taught him a lesson when he was still a boy. A warrior who controls his spirit is stronger than one who controls only his weapon. So he simply rode to the general store and dismounted quietly. The bell above the wooden door rang as he stepped inside. The store smelled of flour, leather, and coffee beans. Shelves were stacked with sacks of grain, tools, lanterns, and canned goods brought in by wagon trains from the east. Behind the counter stood the storekeeper, Mr. Wilkins, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, who had spent many years running the shop. He froze for a moment when Dakota entered. Slowly, Dakota placed the bundle of deer hides on the counter. They were thick, clean, and well-prepared, valuable to anyone who made coats or blankets. Trade, Dakota said calmly. Mr. Wilkins examined the hides carefully. Even though he felt nervous, he could see they were excellent quality. Good hides like these could sell easily. He cleared his throat. Grain? He asked. Dakota nodded. Just as the storekeeper began measuring corn into a sack, loud voices suddenly echoed outside. A stagecoach had arrived. The rumbling wheels and snorting horses stopped near the center of town, and curious townspeople gathered quickly. Stagecoaches brought news, supplies, and sometimes travelers looking for new lives in the West. Dakota stepped near the doorway and looked outside. Among the passengers, climbing down from the coach, was a young woman wearing a travel-stained dress and a small bonnet. She looked tired from the long journey, but hopeful as she stepped onto the dusty street. Her name was Emily Carter. She had traveled hundreds of miles from the eastern United States after answering a newspaper advertisement for a mail-order bride. In those days, some lonely ranchers and farmers placed advertisements asking women to come west for marriage, promising a home and security. Emily believed she was arriving to start a new life, but the moment she spoke with the town sheriff, her hopeful expression faded. The rancher she had come to marry had died 2 weeks earlier in a cattle accident. The news spread quickly through the small crowd. Whispers began. Some people shook their heads in pity. Others murmured unkind jokes about a woman foolish enough to cross the country for a man she had never met. Emily stood there, gripping the handle of her small suitcase, her eyes wide with shock. In a single moment, her entire future had disappeared. From the doorway of the general store, Dakota watched silently. He had come to Silver Creek for something simple: grain to help his people survive the coming months. But as he looked at the frightened young woman standing alone in the middle of the street, he sensed something his elders often spoke about. Sometimes the path a person rides into town for is not the path they ride out with, and without knowing it yet. The fate of the Apache warrior and the stranded mail-order bride had just crossed. The news of the rancher's death spread quickly through the small frontier town of Silver Creek. In places like this, news traveled faster than the wind across the plains. Within minutes, nearly everyone in town knew about the young woman who had arrived as a mail-order bride only to discover the man she had come to marry was already gone. Emily Carter stood near the stagecoach, still clutching the small brown suitcase that held everything she owned. The long journey from the east had already exhausted her, but the shock of the news made her feel even weaker. Just hours ago, she believed she was stepping into a new life. Now she felt like a stranger standing in a place that had no room for her. The stagecoach driver tipped his hat politely before climbing back onto his seat. "Sorry, miss," he said kindly. "Didn't know about the rancher myself. Wish things had turned out different." With a crack of the reins, the coach rolled away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and Emily alone in the street. A few townspeople watched her with curiosity. Others whispered among themselves. Life in the frontier was hard, and strangers were often treated with caution. But a young woman traveling alone attracted even more attention. Some of the older women felt sympathy for her situation, but they also knew how difficult life could be for someone without family or protection. In frontier towns, most women were wives, daughters, or widows connected to a household. A woman without those ties often struggled to find respect or safety. The town sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Dawson, approached Emily slowly. His hat cast a shadow over his weathered face. "Miss," he said gently, "I'm afraid the rancher you came for passed away after a horse accident. It was sudden." Folks around here were shocked too. Emily nodded weakly. "I understand," she replied softly, though the truth still felt impossible to accept. Sheriff Dawson shifted his weight and tried to offer practical advice. "Well, if you're planning to stay a while, the boarding house might rent you a small room. You could find work in town laundry, cooking, maybe helping at the hotel." Emily thanked him politely, but deep inside she felt a quiet fear growing. The small amount of money she carried would not last long, and returning east was almost impossible without enough travel funds. Later that afternoon, Emily found a bench outside the boarding house and sat down. The building was old but clean, and the owner had agreed to give her a room for a few nights until she figured out what to do next. She looked down at her suitcase. Inside were a few dresses, a Bible from her mother, and the letters she had exchanged with the rancher before traveling west. Those letters had promised kindness, security, and a shared future. Now they were only pieces of paper from a life that would never begin. Across the street, several cowboys laughed loudly as they walked out of the saloon. Their boots kicked up dust as they crossed the road. One of them noticed Emily sitting alone. "Well now," he said with a crooked grin, nudging his friend. "Looks like Silver Creek just got itself a lonely traveler." The men approached casually, their voices louder as they drew closer. "Where's your husband, miss?" one asked, pretending innocence. Emily felt her hands tighten around the suitcase handle. Before she could answer, another man chuckled. Maybe she's still looking for one. The laughter made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Suddenly, the sound of quiet footsteps interrupted them. A tall figure stepped. Between Emily and the cowboys, it was Dakota, the Apache. Warrior had finished his trade at the general store and was preparing to leave town. But when he saw the group of men crowding around the young woman, something inside him told him to stop. Dakota did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. He simply stood there calm, silent, and steady. The cowboys recognized the strength in his presence. Frontier men understood when someone was not to be challenged lightly. One of them shrugged awkwardly. "Easy, friend," he muttered, backing away. "We were just talking." Within seconds, the group drifted back toward the saloon. The street became quiet again. Emily looked up at the Simla, Apache warrior standing beside her. She had noticed him earlier in the day, but had not expected him to help. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Dakota gave a small nod. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Two strangers from completely different worlds stood in the same dusty street. But in that silent moment, something important happened. For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, Emily felt that someone had treated her with simple respect, not curiosity, not pity, and not cruelty. And though Dakota had come to town only to gather grain for his people, he now understood something clearly. The young woman sitting on that bench had no place to go. And sometimes the path of honor begins with helping someone who cannot stand alone. The next morning in Silver Creek began quietly. A pale sunrise stretched across the dusty horizon, and the town slowly came to life. Ranchers prepared their horses, shopkeepers swept the wooden sidewalks, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the small cafe near the corner. Emily Carter had barely slept. Her small room in the boarding house was simple: a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small window that looked out toward the empty street. The long journey west had been tiring, but worry kept her awake most of the night. She kept thinking about the same question: what would she do now? Her money was limited, and work in a frontier town was difficult to find. Some women worked in laundry or kitchens, but those jobs paid very little. Others found work in saloons, serving drinks or entertaining guests. But Emily knew she could never live that kind of life. She had come west hoping for a family and a future. Instead, she had arrived alone. After dressing, she stepped outside into the cool morning air and sat on the same bench in front of the boarding house where she had rested the day before. Her suitcase rested beside her feet. Across town, Dakota was preparing to leave Dot at the general store. The storekeeper finished tying 2 sacks of grain and lifted them carefully onto Dakota's horse. The hides he had traded were good quality, and the exchange had been fair. Dakota thanked the man with a respectful nod that he had accomplished what he came for. His tribe would have food for the coming weeks. Yet, as he placed his foot in the stirrup to mount his horse, his eyes moved down the street, and he noticed the young woman again. Emily sat quietly on the bench, staring at the ground. She looked smaller in the bright morning light, as if the weight of uncertainty had settled onto her shoulders. Dakota remembered the way the men had laughed at her the day before, and the uncomfortable feeling it had stirred inside him. In his culture, leaving someone helpless was considered dishonorable. His grandmother had once told him a lesson he never forgot. A warrior's strength is measured not by the battles he wins, but by the lives he protects. Dakota paused. For a moment, he considered riding away. Helping the woman would bring complications. Their worlds were different, and he knew many settlers feared his people. But something inside him would not allow him to ignore the situation. So instead of leaving town, Dakota walked his horse slowly down the street toward the boarding house. Emily looked up when she heard the quiet sound of approaching footsteps. The Keys, Apache warrior, stopped a few feet away. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, unsure how to begin the conversation. Dakota spoke slowly, choosing simple words. "You have family here?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "No," she replied quietly. "I came for marriage, but the man I came for is gone." Dakota nodded. He already understood that part of the story. "You go back east?" he asked. Emily looked down at her hands. "I don't have enough money for the journey," she admitted. "And I don't know anyone here." The honesty in her voice made the situation even clearer. She was truly alone. Dakota stood silently for a moment, thinking carefully. Among his people, decisions were not rushed. A person was expected to consider the consequences of their choices. Finally, he spoke again. "My people have camp in the valley," he explained. "Families, elders, children." Emily listened, unsure where the conversation was leading. "You come," Dakota continued calmly. "Stay until you find your path." Emily blinked in surprise. The offer was unexpected, almost unbelievable. She had grown up hearing stories about native tribes that were often filled with fear and misunderstanding. Yet the man standing in front of her had shown nothing but quiet kindness since the moment she arrived. Still, the decision felt enormous. "You mean, come with you?" she asked carefully. Dakota nodded once. "You will be safe." The street was quiet. A few townspeople watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. Emily looked at the dusty road stretching west beyond the town. Everything she had planned for her life had already fallen apart. Staying in Silver Creek offered little hope, but the Apache warrior standing before her had offered something rare in the frontier. Respect, trust, and safety. Taking a deep breath, Emily slowly stood up and picked up her suitcase. "I'll come," she said. Dakota helped secure the small suitcase to the saddle. Then he mounted his horse and reached a steady hand down to help Emily climb up behind him. From across the street, Several townspeople watched in stunned silence. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. The Apache who had come into town only to trade for grain was now riding away with the stranded mail-order bride. Traveling behind him, neither Dakota nor Emily fully understood it yet, but that single decision was about to change both of their lives. Forever the ride out of Silver Creek was long and quiet. The town slowly disappeared behind them as Dakota guided his horse along a narrow trail that wound through dry hills and open grassland. Emily held carefully onto the saddle, feeling both nervous and hopeful at the same time. The western land stretched wide in every direction. She had never seen so much open space in her life. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, and distant mountains stood like silent guardians on the horizon. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Dakota understood that Emily needed time to adjust. Everything around her was unfamiliar, the land, the culture, and the people she was about to meet. After several hours of riding, they reached a green valley surrounded by rocky hills. A small river curved through the land, and smoke rose gently from several cooking fires. Emily realized they had arrived at Dakota's home. The Apache camp was very different from the dangerous images she had heard about as a child. Instead of warriors preparing for battle, she saw families living their daily lives. Children ran through the grass laughing, women prepared food near the fires, and elders sat beneath the shade of cottonwood trees, sharing stories. When Dakota rode into the camp, several people looked up with curiosity. They noticed the unfamiliar woman riding behind him. Dakota dismounted first and helped Emily down carefully. A few of the elders approached, including an older woman with kind but watchful eyes. She was Dakota's aunt, a respected member of the community. Dakota spoke to her quietly in his language, explaining who Emily was and why he had brought her there. The older woman studied Emily for a moment, then gave a small nod of understanding. "You are welcome here," she said slowly in careful English. Emily felt relief wash over her. She had feared she might be unwelcome, but the kindness in the woman's voice made her feel safer. Over the next few days, Emily began to learn about life in the camp. Everything was different from the town she had known. People worked together closely. Food was shared among families, and decisions were often made by elders after careful discussion. Respect for nature was an important part of daily life. Emily watched as the women prepared meals using corn, beans, and wild herbs gathered from the land. They showed her how to grind corn into meal and how to cook flat bread over a small fire. At first, Emily felt awkward and unsure of herself. But the women were patient teachers. One afternoon, Dakota's aunt handed Emily a basket and showed her how to gather edible plants along the riverbank. As they walked together, the older woman explained how the Apache respected the land. "The earth gives life," she said gently. "If we care for it, it cares for us." Emily listened carefully. Back east, she had learned many things in school, but she had never learned this kind of wisdom about living with the land. In return, Emily began sharing some of the skills she knew. She could read and write well, something many people in the camp had never learned because schools were far away. Soon, several children began sitting beside her in the evenings as she showed them letters and simple words by drawing in the dirt with a stick. She also knew basic home remedies her father had taught her. When a young boy scraped his knee while playing, Emily carefully cleaned and wrapped the wound using cloth from her suitcase. The boy's mother thanked her with a warm smile. Slowly, Emily began to feel like she belonged. Dakota watched these changes quietly. He had expected the transition to be difficult. But Emily showed courage and kindness with everyone she met. She treated his people with respect and curiosity rather than fear. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Dakota sat near the edge of the camp watching the river flow past. Emily approached and sat beside him. The sky turned orange and gold above the valley, and the sound of evening birds filled the air. "This place is beautiful," Emily said softly. Dakota nodded. "It is home," he replied. For a moment, they simply watched the sunset together. Dakota had spent most of his life protecting his heart. The frontier was a dangerous place, and loss was something many people knew too well. But as he looked at the woman beside him, he felt something unexpected. The lonely warrior who had ridden into Silver Creek only days before had begun to realize something important. The stranger he had rescued was slowly becoming a part of his world, and perhaps a part of his future as well. Autumn slowly settled over the valley where Dakota's people lived. The air grew cooler, and the leaves along the river turned shades of gold and red. The camp prepared carefully for winter, gathering firewood, storing food, and repairing shelters before the cold winds arrived. Emily had now lived with the Apache community for several months. What once felt strange had slowly become familiar. She helped the women grind corn and prepare meals, and every evening a group of children gathered around her so she could teach them letters and simple reading. At first the lessons were just a curiosity for the children, but soon even some of the adults began listening quietly as Emily showed them how written words could tell stories or share messages across long distances. The elders appreciated her patience and kindness. Emily, in return, continued learning from them. She had begun to understand how deeply the Apache respected the balance of nature. Nothing was taken from the land without gratitude. Hunting, gathering plants, and caring for animals were all done with careful thought. Life in the camp was simple, but it was filled with cooperation and dignity. Dakota noticed the change in her every day. The frightened woman he had first seen sitting alone in Silver Creek was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, and deeply connected to the people around her. But peace on the frontier rarely lasted forever. One afternoon, a young scout rode quickly into camp on horseback. His expression was serious. Several settlers from Silver Creek were riding toward the valley. They were angry. Rumors had spread through town that cattle had been stolen from a nearby ranch. Some ranchers believed the Apache were responsible. Dakota knew the accusation was false. His people had not taken any cattle. But fear and suspicion often moved faster than truth on the frontier. Within an hour, dust clouds appeared on the distant road. A group of armed men from Silver Creek rode toward the camp. Some carried rifles. Others shouted angrily as they approached. Women gathered the children and moved them safely behind the shelters, while several Apache warriors stepped forward beside Dakota. They were ready to defend their homes, if necessary. Emily watched the scene with growing worry. She knew how quickly violence could start. If even one gun was fired, the situation could turn into tragedy. Then she remembered something important. Many of the settlers in Silver Creek had never truly spoken with the Apache. They only believed rumors and stories passed from person to person. Someone needed to tell the truth before the first shot was fired. Without hesitation, Emily stepped forward. "Wait," she said to Dakota. He looked at her with concern. "It is dangerous," he warned. But Emily shook her head. "I know some of the people in town now," she explained. "If they see me, they might listen." Before anyone could stop her, Emily walked out toward the approaching riders. The settlers slowed their horses when they recognized her. "Miss Carter?" one rancher said in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Emily took a steady breath. "The Apache did not steal your cattle," she said firmly. "I live here. I see what happens every day." The men looked at each other uncertainly. "If your cattle are missing," she continued, "it is more likely the bandits who have been robbing travelers along the trade road. They've taken horses and supplies from both settlers and tribes." Her words caused the group to pause. The ranchers had indeed heard rumors about bandits in the region. Emily spoke calmly but confidently, explaining everything she had witnessed during her time in the camp. She told them how the Apache gathered food, respected the land, and avoided conflict whenever possible. Finally, the sheriff of Silver Creek, who had ridden with the group, raised his hand. "She's telling the truth," he said slowly. "Miss Carter's an honest woman." The angry tension began to fade. After several quiet moments, the ranchers turned their horses away. No shots were fired. As the riders disappeared back toward town, a deep sense of relief spread across the valley. Emily returned to the camp, where Dakota and the elders waited. She had done something incredibly brave. Not only had she stopped a fight, but she had also opened the small door of understanding between two communities that had long feared each other. Dakota looked at her with quiet admiration. She had protected his people without using weapons or force only. Courage and truth. In that moment, he realized something deeply important. Emily had not only found a place in the camp. She had become someone his people could trust, and she had saved far more than their safety. She had saved the fragile hope of peace. Winter had returned to the valley, bringing cold winds and occasional snow that dusted the hills in white. Dakota's people were well prepared this time. The grain he had traded for in Silver Creek had kept them fed, and firewood was stacked high. Life in the camp moved at a steady rhythm, and the days were filled with work, learning, and quiet evenings by the fire. Emily had grown comfortable in her new home. She had learned how to cook and preserve food the Apache way, how to tend small gardens, and even how to track animal trails alongside Dakota. But more importantly, she had grown close to the people she once viewed as strangers. The children now ran to greet her each morning, calling her teacher, and the elders listened to her stories of life in the East. Fascinated by her words and knowledge, Dakota watched all of this quietly. He had never expected to feel this way. The warrior who had entered Silver Creek for nothing more than a few sacks of grain had found something far greater. Every day he saw Emily's courage, her kindness, and her ability to bridge the two worlds, hers and his own. One evening, after the work was done and the children had been sent to bed, Dakota and Emily walked to the edge of the camp. The valley stretched out below them, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The river reflected the colors of the sky, and the surrounding hills seemed almost peaceful. as if the land itself had accepted the balance between the people who lived on it, that Emily spoke first, her voice quiet in the crisp air. "I never imagined life could be like this," she said. "I thought the West would be dangerous, lonely, filled with fear. But you and your people have shown me something else. You've shown me respect, community, and hope." Dakota nodded, a rare softness in his expression. "You have brought courage to us as well," he said. "You were brave when it mattered. You spoke the truth. You protected the camp. You taught us new things, and in return, you learned our ways. That takes a strong heart." Emily smiled, but her gaze fell toward the river. She had thought she had lost everything when she arrived in Silver Creek. Now, she realized she had found more than she could have imagined. A home, safety, and a place where she belonged. Dakota stepped closer. "Emily," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "the path you took, it was not easy. You left your family, your home, everything you knew, and yet you stayed. You became part of my people, and part of my life." Emily turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his. She could see the sincerity in his gaze, the honesty that had drawn her to trust him in the first place. "Dakota," she whispered. He took a deep breath. "Will you stay with me? Not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as my wife, my companion?" Her heart beat faster. For months, she had feared she would never find a place in this new land, let alone someone who would care for her as Dakota did. And now, here he was offering not just protection, but love. Emily nodded slowly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." That night, a quiet peace settled over the valley. The wind whispered through the trees, and the river reflected the light of the full moon. Dakota and Emily sat by the fire together, speaking softly and listening to the sounds of the land. The Apache warrior who had entered Silver Creek with only a simple purpose grain for his people had found something far more valuable. A woman who would share his life, his community, and his heart, and the young mail-order bride who had arrived alone, lost, and uncertain had discovered something she had never imagined, a home, acceptance, and a love that would endure through the seasons of life. Sometimes, the journey we take is not about the destination we expect. Sometimes it is about the people who help us discover who we truly are. In the quiet of the valley, with snow beginning to fall softly around them, Dakota and Emily knew they had both found something extraordinary, each other. The grain had been necessary to survive the winter, but love, respect, and courage had given them life beyond survival. They had saved each other's hearts forever.